today we are talking about the 5 misconceptions around open source technologies. And today I am joined by my friend, Ricardo Sueiras, who is a developer advocate at AWS. Ricardo, how are you doing, man?
Hello, and thank you for inviting me onto your stream, your podcast. I'm doing great, actually. Very good to see you again. It's been a while, but yeah, awesome.
So tell me from your perspective and from everything that you've been doing over the years in open source, what is your first topic or misconception that I think you've seen within open source?
I think the first one is that open source is everywhere, right? So, you know, if you go to your kitchen, you got a blender. I bought a blender recently. It's got an LED screen. Okay, I was looking at the manual to figure out how to use it. At the very end, what surprised me, had a whole bunch of stuff about open source licenses. Right? I thought, whoa, that's really cool. Washing machine. We had to update our washing machine recently. Same thing. It's got Wi-Fi. My washing machine's got Wi-Fi. Why it needs it, I have no idea. Maybe to communicate to the toaster. I don't know, but or the fridge. But it also has a section for legal notices. Go to the website and you see all the legal notices. When I was in Asia last year, there's this very famous pickup truck that everyone drives there, and I was looking at it, and their infotainment system that uses open source. So I think the misconception that people have is that open source is just hobbyists, right, or nerds using it. But no. Open source literally is everything. If you look at your mobile phone, if you look at your TV, if you look at the car you're driving, the trains you're riding in, the planes you're traveling in, the websites you use, it is literally everywhere. You cannot escape. And I think that's something that I don't think necessarily people really appreciate.
And I love that. And I think that ties into, I think, one of my misconceptions around open source technologies, spending a lot more time in it is, you know, first off, you don't realize that it's everywhere, right? But you know what you're saying too, behind the scenes and a lot of these other places outside of some of these smaller GitHub repos, that is quite the opposite, right?
Yeah,
there
totally.
Can be thousands of people working on these different projects, and they are quite mature and used in, you know, enterprise settings all the time.
So I mean, I think, you know, let's put some color on that. I mean, we wouldn't have cloud right today if it wasn't for open source. When I got into cloud early, around 2008. Funnily enough, going back to VMware, your VMware roots, I was designing VMware infrastructure. I was VCP certified and all that, and I was doing building some clusters to do load testing. Okay, some big EMC Documentum servers that we had for a customer, and I needed to generate like tens of thousands of virtual users, and it was really expensive to do this. Right, it was like, you know, literally thousands and thousands of pounds. And I was reading a blog post, Billy Newport from IBM, great guy. I'm not sure if he's still around at IBM, but at the time he was one of their gurus. And he said, "Oh, I've just started playing around with this thing called AWS EC2, right? And I can basically create a VM. I download some software on my machine. I package it up. I then upload it, and then I can fire it off, and I can connect to it." And so I did. I tried it, and I basically in one week, I was able to create VMs. It was CentOS at the time, Linux, generate literally 50,000 virtual users for about maybe $50-$60, right, of cost. And my boss was very happy with me, right? I was like suddenly the hero that saved the day, right? And that's when I realized that, geez, man, there's something in this cloud, right? But all the software I was using was open source. And then when I started then basically helping that company and their customers explore what is cloud, this is very early, so 2008, 2009. What was interesting is a lot of the proprietary vendors didn't really understand cloud, didn't know how to approach it. And so they had quite often hostile licensing. So, you know, Business Objects was one of the early ones that basically said you were not allowed to use this on the cloud, right? And so, of course, that favored open source. So suddenly you had this like momentum of this amazing ability to run anything you wanted. That favored open source. It was like almost like a magical mix, right? So I think that accelerated that whole drive to open source being absolutely ready for mission critical workloads.
Great. What other misconceptions have you seen?
Yeah, so that's a lot. That's a lot on the first one. So I guess the second one, is that many people think that open source is about technology, when in reality, technology is an important, but I guess it's a diminutive part of what open source is. And really, open source is about people. It's about communities. Whether that's, how you can kind of manage and form a community around some technology, or really more a problem, right? So open source starts with a developer scratching an itch, we say, right? And they kind of like they focus on that and they start working on it, and then maybe other people think, I've got the same problems, I want to help you, or they get a value from an open source project, say, I really love this, I'm going to join. So my story with Apache Airflow is that I love that project. The community is incredible. One of the best examples of a welcoming open source community that helps you join the community, helps you move up from being a user to being a contributor. And I think that's really, I think, what open source is to me, right? It's really about how you kind of get people to work towards the same goal. And I'm not just talking about developers now, because I think technical or other code contributions to projects are probably, I remember Matt AC saying, I think they were 39%. He did a blog post ages ago, but let's say they're 40, 45% of projects. You still need people to write documentation. You still need people to run it and test it.
Exactly.
You still need people to log issues and triage issues. You need people to run releases, right? There's a whole bunch of activities that actually kind of comes to like my third misconception, right? Segue, which is that a project is not the same as a product, right? And a lot of people, make this assumption, and this is not I mean, I'm borrowing heavily from someone who said that before me. I can't remember who that was. So apologies. But yeah, I think if you take source code from a project, right? Can you run that as a company, right? And the answer is you might be able to, right? But the reality is that when you buy a product, what they've done is taken the source code, they've compiled it for you, they've put documentation together, they've made it easy for you to install, they provide support. And so I think a lot of people sometimes get the two confused. And this is why, you are able to, open source all your code and still run a very successful business, right? Because you know the code better than anyone else, right? And it's a good feedback system, because if you do want to create products from open source, then you're incentivized to make sure you've got the best contributors to lead the innovation and keep pushing that product forward, right? And you see that with the various groups that run various open source projects, right? They've got centers of excellence, like Apache Airflow, is a large percentage of astronomer folks are in there, but not just them, right? Within the AWS, we've got a small but amazing group who are, they're maintainers now, who contribute to that project, right? So so I think, second one is about community over, we call it, Apache says community over code, right? But then segue into that is that the projects themselves are not products, right? And I think so I've thrown two and three in there, all kind of like all together.
Well, and I think just going back and touching on what you were talking about with two, that was definitely a misconception for me when I'm looking at this. It's a little overwhelming when you're newer to the open source communities and you go, I'm not a developer, I don't know Java, or I don't know C, or whatever code base they're using for the project. And you're like, well, how can I contribute? You're just kind of a lurker at that point.
Well, that's a really great point, actually. It's a really good, sorry to interrupt, but it's a really important point, because it was Rich Bowen, who I work with, lucky to work with, who works also in the Apache Foundation. He told me, he said, one of the things is that, people go into open source thinking that everyone knows more than they do, right? But that's not the case, right? So you're absolutely right. I think people go into open source projects, oh, these are super smart people, how can I possibly contribute? Well, the reality is that absolutely you can.
What's your next one? I think we're at
number four. Okay, controversial one. This
one
controversial one. Okay, so I think open source, so if we go back historically, right, from when open source started, so 1998 was when I think the term open source was termed, and OSI licenses were kind of like a thing. It's very interesting to see historically. The first probably decade, maybe decade and a half, was really all spent trying to earn trust with companies, right? And the business, basically, to say this is open source, it's good for your business, and this is why it's good for your business. And it was really a really kind of like, for me anyway, it was framed around kind of developer kind of like autonomy, right? So what open source allowed you to do as a company was have this kind of like mechanism where you could use software without negotiation, right? Because before that, if you were trying to build software and use components, you'd have this dance, right? Especially maybe not necessarily in startups, but in the enterprise space, where you'd have to get the lawyers in, right? Procurement, legal, IP counsel, and you'd have to do and figure out, okay, who do I need to speak to license this? And open source kind of removed all of that, because once you were comfortable with the wording of the licenses, then kind of R&Q, so risk and quality or compliance teams within these enterprises became more comfortable, and they would like auto approve certain licenses, right? Which meant that as a business, you can now start building software that use those components. And so we got into this kind of golden era whereby companies were comfortable with open source licenses. They started building their software using open source software, and they kind of took it for granted. And more recently, we've had, unfortunately, people who are trying to kind of like almost like I mean it's a strong word, but hoodwink developers. So we had when Llama the generative AI model came out. The company behind it, a big company, they deliberately, well, I say that's a strong word, I don't know if they deliberately did it, but they termed it open source when it clearly wasn't open source, right? It didn't have an open source license, but they didn't care. They called it open source. And so the OSI came out and they wrote a blog post about this saying it's not open source. People who know open source knew it wasn't open source. But if you ask any, and I've been to lots of meetups, I've done lots of talks since that announcement, and developers think it's open source. And when I say it's not open source, they go, but it is open source because they say it's open source. They trust that company name. And so I think it's caused huge damage, I think, to open source, because now we're in a situation where you just have to say something that's open source and people just believe it.
But they're not licensing it with an open source license.
Exactly. And I think this is something that I think that we need to fix, because I think there's too many developers now, younger developers, who don't really understand what open source is. And I do see this as a pattern. I do a lot of talks at universities and students, and the level of knowledge in open source really isn't great. I wish we did a better job at helping convey to developers so they had a good foundation. Where developers come a cropper is when I read Hacker News and I see people talking about the mistakes they made because they didn't understand how open source licenses worked, right? So I think one of the fourth misconception really is that if you think something is open source, make sure you know what that means, right? So open source is an OSI compliant license, and also know the difference between open source and free software. They're two different things, right? And maybe you might not care, which is fine. But what my worry, so the reason why I've mentioned this as a misconception, is that businesses for a long time have been reliant on open source, like open source software, to build and ship applications that they don't have to think about. And I worry now that with these new licenses that are open source, right, they're building using components, and they're going to get stung, right? So what I would say is beware. If you're a developer, spend some time understanding about what open source really is. Get comfortable, with it, and maybe if you work within an organization enterprise, form some kind of regular meetup. Bring people in from open source community to help you understand more if you're not quite sure, just so that you understand what is open source and not open source, so that your business isn't going to have any mishaps.
Yeah, definitely. Understand the licensing. All right, well, let's wrap up with our last one, fifth and last one.
Last one. So this one is it's really that open source isn't actually just one thing, right? So there's this phrase, the 4 pillars of open. So we've talked about mostly at the moment about the first pillar, which is open source licensing, right? And actually we've touched upon the community aspect, open source communities, right? So those are 2 important pillars of open source, right? But there's open source design and there's open source governance, right? Which are also very, very important. Open source design is how you make sure that you build your open source project in a way that you can feed in enhancements, improvements from the broader community, because you do get some projects, okay, where they are all the control has been with one person or a small group of people, right? So they decide all the design, what gets through. They design the build systems and all that kind of stuff, right? So and then open governance really is how you make sure that that's the open governance piece. How do you make sure that your project is set up in a way that you're getting all that great input from the diverse group of your community, and not just your own ideas, right? There's real value for that. And then and kind of the open source kind of development, the third pillar, is really about how you then kind of put together the systems and the roles. We talked about not all roles are developers. Some are running the CI/CD systems. Some are triaging the GitHub issues. How do you pull together how your project works from a development perspective? I mean, I talked about Airflow. Airflow has got a team that built this thing called Breeze. Breeze is how you effectively make changes, right? So you download the system, all runs on containers. Make your code changes. You can do all your tests locally, and once everything's okay, you can then basically comfortably do your pull request, right? But they've built that, right? They built that to make sure more people can contribute. On a smaller scale, it means things like making sure that you've got a contribution markdown document that tells you how to build this project, how to run this project. It's having tests, including tests, so that when you do make changes, you can test to make sure you've not broken anything. So the 4 pillars of open source, license, community, governance, and design, these 4 are really what I say are characteristics of projects that are successful, right? You can do open source with just the open source license, right? But you're only going to go so far. Community will get you a bit further, but when you do all 4, that's when you see the biggest impact, the biggest payoff from open source. So that's the kind of the I guess the last misconception is that open source isn't just that one thing. It's a collection of things that work together, to make the biggest impact.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Ricardo. It's always a pleasure getting to talk to you. I'm glad that you were able to come and join us for this episode. Any last words?
One of the things I used to advise companies, my customers who are wanting to know about open source, was that I was saying that many of the open source projects, the way they run, the way they're able to coordinate these big engineering releases among developers who are volunteers. I would advise engineering directors, CTOs, put some of your people in these projects. They can be lurkers, right? They can just do nothing but watch, because you will learn so much about how modern software is being developed and being built. They're using all the latest tools, all the latest methodologies. And if anything, you are learning by practitioners who are actually building mission critical software. And I know,
Yeah.
and that was one of the first steps I would advise customers in enterprise kind of like situations to kind of like make the first step to learn more about how they're doing and bring some of those practices back into their enterprise development spaces. And so this was often a way to kind of get them to kind of try agile for the first time, get them to do CI/CD for the first time, and use some of these modern tools, right? And so I think there's lots of ways enterprises can kind of like sort of if they're not doing it today, they can. You can start anytime, right? And these communities, welcome lurkers, right? Because eventually a portion of those lurkers do end up then moving up the food chain.
They get comfortable being in there. They're not as afraid that people are going to look at them, and they don't feel like imposters as much. Like, hey, I can contribute here, and then they become, an active part of that project for sure.
Yeah, totally.
What people find you after this podcast?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Blue Sky. I think those are the only two I'm on these days. So LinkedIn, I'm very prolific on LinkedIn. So you can find me there. I do have a blog. So it's blog.beachgeek.co.uk. And I'm on Dev2 as well. So you'll see my content on there.
Awesome. And I will add links to all of those in our description for you as well. For everyone that's still here watching, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next time. Have a good one. Bye-bye.